Welcome to our study on the book of Romans. This is Romans Education Part 7, and this is going to be Session 3. Because we took that little bit of a break last week to talk about when Christ was crucified on Easter Sunday, let's get right back to the verses so we can get ourselves thinking together. Romans chapter 13, verses 11 through 14 constitute the second component of godly judgment. And so here's how they read. And that knowing the time, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep. For now is our salvation nearer than when we believed. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Let us therefore cast off the works of darkness, and let us put on the armor of light. Just to review very briefly where we were 2 weeks back, in those first two sessions, when we were just beginning to look at Romans 13, 11 through 14, I told you that one of the important things to understand is that the education now is about to change. We kind of went through a door when we made the cry of Abba Father and understood that as sons we're going to be educated to labor with Him in His business. And now that you've come this far in the education, and I could put this up here very quickly because we've not only gone through a sonship orientation and a sonship establishment, but in Romans chapter 12, verse 1 to 13, verse 10, we have gone through all of those areas of our education. We've gone through the two components to godly wisdom, the two components. Now I say we've gone through it. The initial instruction in it. We got introduced to it and we got the initial instruction in it. But the two components of godly wisdom, the two components of godly justice, and the first component of godly judgment. And this is important. I'm not just reviewing this because you don't know this. What we're about to look at in verse 11, you need to have this in your thinking. Remember back in your sonship orientation, you understood that you were a son, not just because you're saved and part of the family of God, but in your sanctification. You have been made a son, and not just a son, but an adopted son, which means your Heavenly Father wants to train you to participate in His business. And then we did our sonship establishment, and that constituted the rest of Romans 8, and really chapters 9 through 11, where we talked about the dispensational change. All of that was getting you established as a son. And then we started the education, and we've done 2 parts of wisdom, 2 parts of justice, 1 part of judgment. And it is at this point right here, I'm going to draw the line, because this is where the change is about to take place. And so and that's one of the things that we talked about in those previous 2 lessons, that the education is now about to step up a level. And it's going to require some things out of us that up to this point weren't required. Now you might be saying, how in the world do you get that? And that's what I'm going to show you today as we move on through this passage. So the last part that I want to give you by way of review is that we looked at that threefold commitment that the believing remnant was going to make as it was recorded back there in the book of Proverbs. Remember, the first one was the commitment of honest attendance. That it's not just that you're going to show up to learn the things that you need to learn, but that we're all here for that reason. Well, look, we've all been involved in church. I suppose we all have, but for most of us, we've been involved in churches where there was a lot of people that were coming for a lot of different reasons. And so not listing what those are, honest attendance says, the reason I'm here is because I want to get this education. The second part of that commitment was interactive learning. And that means I am going to get this, and if there's something about it I don't understand, I'm going to ask about it. And the third one was that this is the top priority. It doesn't mean that there are not other things that are important in your life. There are. But this has to be given the place that you... And by the way, if you don't see this that way, then there is probably Remember the sonship establishment? This took place mostly in Romans chapter 8 from verses 17 to 39. If this isn't in your thinking right, there is something right back up here that you probably missed. Because it was back up there that you got an appreciation for just how important this education is. And you got an idea back there of the value of what this was going to accomplish, not just for you, but also in your Heavenly Father's plan and purpose. Back there, that's when this was supposed to become the big deal that it is to your Father. Okay, so having said that, let me see if I've got this on the PowerPoint. Oh, I didn't finish the verses, did I? Did I quit? Did I read these verses? I did? Let me keep going. Verse 13. Let us walk honestly as in the day, not in rioting and drunkenness, not in chambering and wantonness, not in strife and envying, but put ye on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make not provision for the flesh to fulfill the lust thereof. Okay, and so as we're looking at these threefold commitments, all right, I'll just leave it there because we're going to get to it. We understand what these are. The believing remnant of Israel was asked to make those, and we saw those back in Proverbs. And here they are. Because if they did these, then all of these were going to equal something. There was something they were going to get, and they had to do all three steps in order to get this to work. And that was to get the wisdom and the understanding that they needed to have. Okay, so here it is in Proverbs 2. My son, if thou wilt receive my words and hide my commandments with thee, and by the way, those commandments are not referring to the law of Moses. We talked about that back when we were in that. So that, and here's that first one. Remember, see the first if thou wilt receive my words, verse 2, so that thou incline thine ear unto wisdom and apply thine heart to understanding. That is what's involved in honest attendance. In other words, that's what we got out of that. You're inclining your ear unto wisdom and you're applying your heart to understanding. If that's not why we're here, we're just here for the wrong reason. So that's the honest attendance. Verse 3, yea, if thou criest after knowledge and liftest up thy voice for understanding. Understand what this is. This is not you crying to God to do something for you that you just want done. This is crying to your Father about wanting to learn. You can't just, you can, it just won't work. You can't just fill in the blank. You know, I'm crying after God for a new car. This is not what this is talking about. This is the commitment to the education. So, this crying after knowledge and lifting up your voice for understanding, let me give an example of how that works. We get through the lesson and at the end you go, there's a part I don't quite understand. You know what you're doing? You're lifting up your voice for understanding. That's what you're doing. Or maybe you're just having a conversation. I know that there are folks in this room, there are couples in this room that have conversations about the sonship education. And you may have times where you're talking about this. You know what? That's another way that this gets done. But that's the interactive learning. And now, here's the third one. If thou seekest her as silver and searchest for her as for hid treasure. And this is what we talked about last week. Seeking it as silver. That's the silver coins that are in your pocket. Or searching for her as for hid treasure. And we talked about those two. And I mean, it's all in those notes. But look, you understand that the difference between having silver in your pocket because you work a job and searching for hid treasure, those are two different things. Searching for hid treasure takes more time and effort. That's the step up in the level that we're about to get to. But if you do this, and by the way, how important, and this is what we talked about, that's why I'm doing this little quick review, how important is it for you to have an income, for you to have a roof over your head, or clothes on your back, or food on your table? Pretty important. Well, that's what he's saying. You seek this like you do that. Because even though this is something of a spiritual nature, not tangible like silver, he does come along in the next chapter in Proverbs and says, the merchandise of this wisdom is better than the merchandise that silver can buy. Or credit card. All right, now, verse 5, here's what all that equals. So we've seen 3 ifs. If you do this, if you do this, and if you do this, verse 5, then shalt thou understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. So if you want that knowledge, there's the recipe. There's got to be honest attendance, there's got to be interactive learning, and it's got to be top priority. And if those things aren't in place, that knowledge is going to escape you. Okay, now having said that, when we come back into Paul's epistles, and this is something I haven't talked to you about before, but when you come back into Paul's epistles, he doesn't repeat those exact words to us in the book of Romans, or any other of his epistles for that matter. So if we look back and we say, well, this is sitting in Proverbs 2, and it is there for the believing remnant, but what about us? Where are we? What kind of, does Paul talk to us at all about a commitment that we're supposed to make? Well, indeed he does. Because what he's going to tell you in Romans chapter 8, that you are led by the Spirit in this sonship curriculum that you've been given. But if he's leading you, what is it your responsibility to do? To follow. And that's your honest attendance. If you're not willing to do that, you're not going to get the knowledge that you're supposed to need. Here's the second part of that. We learned early on in the education that we are part of a body. And as part of a body, we're going to be, God means for this education to actually go on in a body. So that there's many members that are all functioning in different offices, and that's the way we learn this education. Look, I know it's very tempting for someone, you know, and I'm not, look, I'm trying to think about how to say this, because there are folks all around the country who don't have a church to go to that does this. So I'm not trying to say something that's going to make their life difficult. Is it possible for you to do this by yourself? Probably. But let me tell you something. You're going to have to get awfully creative in order to do that. Because I'm going to tell you now that these are the things that a son does. And what a father does is very different. The father's on the other end of this equation. And so a son learns from a father. No, this is going to take me, if I give in to this little temptation to talk about this further, because sometimes I say things to you, and I have an idea in my mind that I know exactly what it is I'm talking about, and I have this feeling that because you don't know what's in my mind, that I'm making a statement and you're going, yep, blood sugar's low. I don't have blood sugar issues, but I'm just saying that.
Use social media and ask questions up that way.
You know, that's a creative way to do that, but she said social media, where people interact with each other and ask questions, emails, and you know, or they get in a room and they do things, and that's a creative way to do that. But let me tell you that there are folks around the country that maybe they're not hooked into that, or they don't know about it, and it's a tough road. That's not really where I wanted to go with this statement. I wanted to go somewhere else with that. But what I'm saying is there is an honest attendance for us, and that is we have to really mean business and be involved with it from that standpoint. The second thing is the interactive learning. If thou criest after knowledge, you know where that is in Paul's epistles? That's that cry of Abba, Father. You know what you're doing is you're saying, yes, I want to be educated. Yes, I want to learn. Yes, I want to know how to labor in my Father's business. And the top priority, I think that comes in Romans 12, 1 and 2. You're familiar with that. I'll just throw it up on the screen. when he says, I beseech you by the mercies of God that you present your bodies a living sacrifice. And then in verse 2 where he talks about being transformed by the renewing of your mind that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. And prove means that you're going to be putting that will on display in your life. That, I think, those are the things that actually require this to be that priority in our life. Now, I could have taken more time with that, but instead I'd like to just take us back. Anyway, that's not everything that we covered last week, but that'll get us thinking all along the same line. So back to Romans 13 and look at verse 11. And that knowing the time, that now, and even though it's in bold, it should have been in yellow, that first now, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep, for now is our salvation nearer than when we believed. Now the reason I want to talk to you about this is, as a matter of fact, we have to define some terms and answer some questions before we can really get what's in this verse. But before I can raise those questions and answer them, I need to talk to you about three brief things. Number one, see that word now up there? That word now is connected to whatever is meant by knowing the time. And I'm going to tell you what that is. But I just want you to see that those things are connected. When he says, and that knowing the time, that now it is high time, there's a connection made between those two. I just want to make that point. That's the first thing. The second thing is this phrase, now it is high time. And I want to talk to you about high time for a moment. The way we use that term, and as a matter of fact, if you look it up in a dictionary that will not just give you a word, but a phrase, do you know what the phrase high time is mostly defined as past time. And you could liken this to a parent that says to their child, you know what, you need to clean that room up. And then the next day you come by and you look and you go, hey, you need to clean this room up. And then finally, about 4 days later, the kid comes in at breakfast and says, oh, I cleaned my room. And a parent may well say it this way, well, it's high time you got that done. And you know what that means? It's past time. You should have already done that. And that's the way I use it too. Because when I see that somebody finally does something, I'm not talking about here in Sonship, but you know, in life, when you ever go to get the tires put on your car and they tell you, yeah, it's going to be about 45 minutes, and an hour and 15 minutes later, you see them pull your car in, and I'll use this phrase, well, it's high time they got our car in there, right? I'm just so patient. All right. I'm really saying it's past time. And if someone says it's past time, you know what that statement becomes then? It becomes a rebuke. Okay, but listen to me carefully. This is really good. You're going to enjoy this. That's not what high time means in this particular case. In this case, this is not a rebuke or a reprimand. This high time is being used in a different way. Because when he talks about high time, I'm going to put this up here and then I'm going to show you something to show you why it's that way. High time is the right time, the appropriate time, the appointed time. We could also say the exact time.
With urgency.
It's the proper time. Yeah, with urgency. That would be a good way to say that. Remember the old Westerns when the two gunfighters were going to walk out onto the street, and when did they always meet? At high noon. What is high noon? That, you know what? We use that expression. They would look at it and say, when the sun is directly overhead. Today, when we say high noon, you know what you're talking about? 12 o'clock, straight up. Well, that high is saying something about the time. That's an expression, high noon. Also, when you say high time, you're also talking about a particular time that is at the apex. In other words, I'm going to give you one more thing here, that the time has fully come. That's high time. In other words, the time is just right. Now look, I know we don't use this phrase much, but when you put a cake in the oven, if you pull it out too early, it won't be done all the way through. If you leave it in too long, either the cake dries out or it burns, right? So there's a high time. There's a proper time. There's a time that's fully, that when it's time to take the cake out. Now I know nobody goes to the oven saying that. Well, it's high time to get the cake out. But that's really what Paul is talking about here. Well, here's what I did. I did a little work on this, and I went back to the Oxford English Dictionary, and let me show you what I found here. This is really great. High time. The appointed due or proper time. So see, it's not always late. Sometimes high time is talking about the time has now arrived. This is the proper time. It's the appointed time. Now I gave you, look in parenthesis below that. Look, in the full Oxford English Dictionary, what they do is when they define a term, they take you back and they give you some illustrations of when the term was used the way they are defining it. So it's not just a normal dictionary, we just have a bunch of definitions. You have a whole lot of stuff in between the definitions. This one takes you back to 1586. And I want to show you this. The guy has actually taken part of Psalm 12:1, and then he's going to add something to it. But he says, Lord, help. And if you see that spelling, H-E-L-P-E, that's because the standardization of English spelling hadn't been arrived at by that time in the 1500s. So there were several ways that you could spell the same word. There did come a day when all that got standardized. But he says, Lord, help. It is high time for me to call. In other words, to call upon the Lord. I need help. It's high time for me to call. Even though that's spelled funny, can everybody see what he's saying there? That high time? That's not throwing you off, is it? That's just the way that it was written back there. That's the way he wrote it back in the 1500s. Now what I want to do is I want to show you another one. Now watch this. This is going to take you about 112 years later. So here we are in 1698. And this one says, it is high time now. Now. Here's that word now. Remember our word? Now it is high time. It is high time now to wind up my bottoms. Now, I got to tell you, I'm going to have to explain this because I couldn't help but laugh when I saw that, because I thought most of us only had one bottom, and this is in the plural. And I thought, and how do you wind that up? And it's capitalized, exactly right. Now, I looked at that, so you know what I had to do? I had to go look that word up. And so I looked that word up, and let me see if I've got it on here. Yeah, I do. A bottom is a clue. I had to go work that one up too. It's a clue or a nucleus on which to wind thread. In other words, it's what's at the center when you wind up thread. And if you don't put anything in the center and you just take thread and you just start to curl it up and wind it on itself, it's a ball of thread. At the end, it'll just run out of thread. You understand what I'm saying? But we have a word that I think came from that. I didn't take the time. I was looking at this and I was having fun with it, but I thought, yeah, I'm killing myself time-wise here. So, but here's the word that I think. How many of us know that we wind thread on a bobbin? Now, you know what I think? It was bottom. It was at the bottom of the thread. That's what it was. But now that word is kind of changed. That's not unknown of in our language. Now we would say we wind thread on a bobbin. So now let me take you back to that. It is high time now to wind up my, yeah. In other words, it's time for me to wind up my threads. See, he's not saying when it's high time to wind up that I'm late. He's saying the proper time has come now for me to wind up my threads. You see what's going on with that? Okay, and so by the way, let me give you one more, because I found Romans 13:11 in the Oxford English Dictionary. Now, it wasn't as a definition, so I had to really look for this. It was kind of like needle in a haystack work. This is why all that other stuff was making me think I'm killing myself time-wise here. But look at this. High time, and then it says Romans 13:11, and this is exactly how it reads in that dictionary. Of time or season, well advanced, look here, fully come, complete. High time is when the time has fully come. And when the time is fully come, it's the proper time, it's the appointed time. You see, it's not late. In other words, when you're talking about high time in this respect, you can't be too early and you can't be too late. You hit it at the proper time. Now I've had the discussion with you about the second thing. Now let me get you to the third thing. And that is going to take us back to Romans 13. Look at this last phrase in the verse. For now is our salvation nearer than when we believed. Here's the other point that I want to make to you. And I should have put this verse up on the board. Let me just put the first part. And that knowing the time, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep, for now is our salvation, I'm just going to abbreviate it, nearer than when we believed. I should have put this up earlier and you wouldn't have had to sit through this. But look, this verse has two different parts to it. And here's where the break comes. The third thing I want to talk to you about, the first thing I talked to you about is that knowing the time and that now, those two things are connected. The second thing about it I wanted to tell you is what high time was about. This is not the high time of a reprimand. It's the high time to say the proper time for something has fully come. And by the way, if he had left that word now out, if he just said, and that knowing the time, that it's high time to awake out of sleep, you could have took that to mean you've overslept. But when he says, now it is high time, that changes the whole meaning now to this. And instead of that being a reprimand, instead, this is an instruction that you have fully come to the proper time to do something. Now, we haven't defined it yet, and we're going to awake out of sleep. What does that mean? You see, when I was first reading this is what was giving me such a headache about this. I kept thinking, awake out of sleep. It's high time to awake out of sleep. So what does it mean? Because you know what? That doesn't give you a good connotation, does it? Right off the bat. It's high time to awake out of sleep. If that's a reprimand, you slept too long. But if he's saying it's the proper time to awake out of sleep, now I've got to know what it means to awake out of sleep. And by the way, that's one of the questions we have to answer. So let me give you the third thing you got to know before we raise all those questions. Here's the third thing, very simply. This is talking about one thing about our time, and this is talking about a totally separate thing about our time. In other words, this is talking about the time... I misspelled that. I didn't give myself enough room. This is talking about the personal time in your life. That's what the last half of the verse is doing. I'll come back and show you this, but I just need to set you up for it. This is talking about the amount of time that is left in your life to do something. And that's the motivator to get this done. Okay, now, having said those three things, and by the way, if all of that isn't clicking in your mind just because I said a few things about it and put it up on the board, don't let that worry you. If it does click, fine. If it doesn't, when we get there, you'll recall what I just said, and then it'll help you make sense of all of that. What I got left here? Okay, good. We're in good shape. Okay, so here we go. Let's see. So here's the questions. I sure hope I put them up on the PowerPoint. In what way is Paul using the word time when he says knowing the time? And I'm going to show you the different ways you can look at that. The second one is, what does Paul mean when he says wake out of sleep? We raised that question just a moment ago. And then thirdly, in what way is Paul using the word salvation? Because look, for now is our salvation nearer than when we believed. He's not talking about being saved from the debt and penalty of your sin. That's already happened, hasn't it? Aren't you justified unto eternal life? So he's not talking about being saved like when you trusted Christ as your Savior. We're going to have to determine in what way is Paul using the word salvation. So all of these are the questions that need to be answered before we do this. All right, now I'm going to pause right here and say this. I saved you. No, I didn't save you in that sense. I mean, I saved you from having to go through the process that I went through. Because it was at this point I began to construct notes, and I took all three of those. Actually, let me do one more thing before I make this statement. Here's the ways you can see when Paul says, in what way is Paul using the word time, and that knowing the time, that can be taken in several ways. Number one, the time that is available for the rest of your life. Oh, I didn't put this one in there, but I could have said, Paul is asking you, what time is it? But you know that one's pretty ridiculous, right? Because whenever you're reading this, you don't want to look up to heaven and go, hey, Paul, it's about 10 minutes after 2. Yeah, I guess I should have read this earlier. Are you late? He's not asking what time it is on your watch. He could be asking what time is it as to where you are in your life. I don't think that's it. That's what this one is talking about. The second half of the verse. Well, again, we'll get to that. Here's the second way he could be talking about the time. He could be talking about the time of this dispensation of grace. Because we haven't always been in the dispensation of grace. And even though in the passage of verses 11 to 14 we're going to get to that issue, that's not what he's talking about here either. And what I saved you from is pages that I wrote. And I didn't do away with them, I just cut them out of your notes. Because I did a lot of work to say, here's why it's not the first one, and here's why it's not the second one. And when I got through, the only things I would have been able to cover was the answers to this. And I wanted to get further than that. So you know what I thought I'd do? I would just tell you how I labored. And you would feel sorry for me. But I cut that out of your notes, and instead we're going to focus on the one that it is. And here's that. The time of where we are in our sonship education. Remember when I put this up and I said, where are we in our sonship education? We've been through sonship orientation, we've been through sonship establishment, we've been through the first two components of wisdom, the first two components of justice, and the first one of godly judgment. I told you, and I said, I'm not just reviewing stuff. This is where you are in the education. Now let me give it to you in a nutshell, because we just have a few minutes left here in this session. And let me show it to you. Because of where you are at this point in the education, you have arrived at the time that has fully come for you to do something. It is high time to do something. And I don't mean it as a reprimand like it's past time. In other words, you have now, because of where you are in the education, you have come to the right time, the exact time, the proper time, the appointed time to now do something. And that something is to awake out of sleep. Now I know we haven't defined that yet, but what I'm trying to show you is what this verse is saying to you, and I wrote it up here so we'd always have it, and that knowing the time of where you have advanced to in your education, you have come to it is now the proper time to do this thing that he has called awaking out of sleep. It's the perfect time. And I'm going to tell you now, you couldn't awake out of sleep, whatever that's talking about, and I'm going to tell you what it is. We couldn't do that before now. We didn't have the capacity. It would be like looking at your 2-year-old and showing him a math book and saying, can you work these problems? But you know what? One day, he'll learn some numbers, and he'll learn how to count, and he'll learn, about how to use them, and then you know what? It will be high time for him to work the problems in that math book. And by that I mean it'll be the appropriate, appointed, proper, and right time. The time will have fully come that he can take what he now knows and do something with it that he has never done before. And folks, that's what we're about to do. We're about to learn doctrine that taking everything that we've gotten up to this point, we're going to take everything that has been given to us, and we're now going to be able to add that to what we're about to learn, and we're going to do something very exciting. Something we have never had the capacity to do before. And this is not something that you're going to do one time and walk away from it. This is something you're going to do for the rest of your sonship life. And by the way, I know I haven't identified it for you yet, but there are people in this room who have been waiting for this day. There are people around the country that are following us that have been waiting for this day, because with what we're about to do, as this education moves us to a new level, is we're about to labor in a very particular area with our Father that we did not have the capacity to do before, but we will not only have that capacity now start to be generated in us, but we will see that the need for this increase as our sonship life goes on. It's a very exciting area. And it has to do with casting off the works of darkness and putting on the armor of light. You have been waiting for the time when you can significantly impact Satan's realm. And now you're going to get introduced to that doctrine. This is the area now that it's going to be different than it was before. The doctrine becomes a little more complex, and it's going to require more time out of you. So before we end this session, let me just remind you of what I beat the drum about the whole time the last Sunday we were on these verses. These verses are telling us that because we're about to now, the education is about to step up a notch, we're going to have to increase our commitment. But it's not just in any way. You say, it's already a top priority for me. I don't know how it can be any more of a top priority. That's not what I'm talking about. Now you're going to make wise, godly decisions about how you spend your time. Because the education is going to require more effort and more time to get this doctrine than anything we've ever encountered up to this point. And this is the way it's going to be for the rest of the education. It's all going to be on this level. And you know what? You had to get all the way to here before you had enough to be introduced to this. So now, and that knowing the time, do you see? Knowing where you are in the education, that now it is high time. It's the right time. Or to take what the dictionary said about Romans 13:11, the time has fully come to do something, to awake out of sleep. Are you following me so far? This is really going to get good for us right here. Okay, so we'll stop because I have 19 seconds left. So, we'll stop right here and we'll take a break and then we'll come back. This is going to be good.